downfall of brilliance, 10 geniuses who crossed the line into madness. We are taught to worship supreme intelligence as the ultimate human shield, a golden ticket to fame, fortune, and an enlightened existence. Yet history's most brilliant minds reveal a far more terrifying truth. The boundary between transcendent genius and complete mental ruin is razor thin. When a hyper-focused brain fractures under the immense pressure of its own creation, the descent is not a gentle slide, but a catastrophic implosion that leaves devastation in its wake. Stay with us, because these shocking stories only get darker from here. 1. Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski's early life was a dizzying ascent up the steep peaks of academic prestige, beginning with his admission to Harvard University at the age of 16. To the outside world, this young prodigy with an estimated IQ of 167 was an intellectual deity in the making, quickly securing his doctorate in mathematics by solving complex geometric functions and becoming the youngest assistant professor of mathematics in the history of UC Berkeley. Yet beneath this glittering veneer of academic brilliance lay a profound, festering void of extreme social alienation and emotional isolation.
The first question
The
isn't,
intense,
did you ever...
suffocating pressure to perform, combined with his participation in a psychologically abusive, CIA-linked Harvard experiment, systematically dismantled his developing psyche. He looked at the rapid advancement of industrial society not as progress, but as a collective psychological prison, and the realization that he was expected to participate in its preservation filled him with an unbearable dread. The turning point came when Kaczynski abruptly resigned from Berkeley, turning his back on the academic establishment to vanish into the wilderness of Lincoln, Montana. In a tiny, primitive cabin without electricity or running water, his intellectual isolation festered into a lethal, obsessive radicalism. When he witnessed the pristine forests around his cabin being destroyed by industrial development, his anger solidified into a terrifying mission. He would spark a revolution against the industrial technological system through calculated violence. For nearly 2 decades, the man known as the Unabomber operated in the shadows, meticulously crafting untraceable mail bombs targeting scientists and academics. His reign of terror resulted in 3 deaths and 23 injuries, paralyzing the nation with fear and triggering the longest, most expensive manhunt in FBI history, which finally ended with his arrest in 1996. Kaczynski spent the rest of his life confined to a concrete cell in a maximum security prison, a stark and agonizing contrast to the wild forests he had violently sought to protect, until his death in 2023. The profound, cautionary lesson of Kaczynski's life lies in the danger of radical intellectual isolation. When an extraordinary mind detaches itself from empathy and the shared human experience, it becomes capable of justifying the most monstrous atrocities in the name of an abstract, utopian ideology. His tragedy is a warning that brilliant logic, when entirely decoupled from human compassion, ceases to be a tool of enlightenment and instead transforms into a devastating engine of terror. 2. Bobby Fischer. Bobby Fischer was the undisputed Mozart of the chessboard, a singular force of nature who single-handedly dismantled the decades-long hegemony of the Soviet Union's state-sponsored chess machine. His crowning achievement came in 1972 during the match of the century in Reykjavik, Iceland, where he defeated Boris Spassky to become the world chess champion, a victory heralded as a monumental triumph for the Western world during the height of the Cold War. However, this victory was achieved under a suffocating canopy of immense psychological pressure and relentless media scrutiny. From a very young age, Fischer's life had been entirely consumed by the 64 squares of the chessboard, leaving him socially stunted and emotionally fragile. The weight of carrying the geopolitical pride of the United States on his shoulders, combined with his natural tendency toward obsessive focus, began to distort his perception of reality. The descent into darkness began almost immediately after his historic victory, when Fischer refused to defend his title under the mandated conditions, resulting in him being stripped of his crown and vanishing into a self-imposed, paranoid exile. For 20 years, he wandered the globe like a ghost, his mind increasingly hijacked by severe delusional paranoia and virulent conspiracy theories. He became utterly convinced that the Soviet government, the FBI, and various shadowy cabals were actively plotting to assassinate him, intercept his phone calls, and steal his intellectual property. His life dissolved into absolute chaos in 1992, when he violated U.S. sanctions to play a rematch in war-torn Yugoslavia, a decision that made him a federal fugitive, permanently severed his ties to his homeland, and relegated him to a transient, unstable existence. Fischer's journey ended in 2008 in Iceland, the very country where he had achieved his greatest triumph, dying of kidney failure at the age of 64, a number poetically matching the squares on a chessboard. He died a stateless, bitter, and profoundly lonely man, having traded the pristine, logical beauty of chess for a mental prison of his own making. His tragic life serves as a somber warning about the perils of singular, obsessive genius that lacks emotional balance and a grounding support system. Fischer's mind was engineered to anticipate threats and see hidden patterns. But when this extraordinary predictive machinery was turned inward on the chaotic, unpredictable real world, it devoured him from the inside out. 3. Thomas Midgley Jr. Thomas Midgley Jr. was once celebrated as one of the most brilliant and prolific industrial chemists in American history, a man whose inventive genius seemed to offer elegant solution to the nagging technical hurdles of the machine age. Working for General Motors, Midgley solved the persistent problem of engine knocking by discovering that the addition of tetrethyl lead to gasoline created a remarkably smooth combustion process. Years later, he struck gold again by developing Freon, the very first non-toxic, non-flammable chlorofluorocarbon, CFC, which revolutionized the refrigeration and air conditioning industries worldwide. However, the driving pressure behind his work was not the pure pursuit of scientific truth, but the relentless, uncompromising demand of corporate capitalism for immediate commercial viability. This intense pressure caused Midgley to systematically ignore and actively suppress emerging scientific red flags regarding the toxic consequences of his creations. The immediate consequences of Midgley's brilliant inventions were nothing short of a slow-motion global catastrophe. The widespread adoption of leaded gasoline released millions of tons of highly toxic lead into the atmosphere, directly poisoning the developing brains of countless generations of children and causing widespread neurological damage on a global scale. Meanwhile, his CFCs silently drifted into the stratosphere, where they began eating away at the Earth's delicate ozone layer, leaving the planet dangerously exposed to harmful solar radiation. Midgley himself suffered from the toxic effects of his own work, experiencing severe lead poisoning that he desperately tried to hide from the public by inhaling lead vapors during press conferences. The final, grotesque climax of his life occurred after he contracted polio, which left him severely paralyzed and confined to a bed. Employing his formidable inventive intellect one last time, he constructed a complex, elaborate system of ropes, pulleys, and harnesses to help him lift himself out of bed without assistance, a tragic contraption that would ultimately fail him. In 1944, at the age of 55, Midgley was found dead in his bed, having become tangled in the complex web of his own ropes and strangled to death by his own invention. His legacy underwent a devastating posthumous transformation, with modern environmental historians labeling him as a one-man environmental disaster who had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism. The dark, cautionary tale of Thomas Midgley Jr. warns us that genius, when completely untethered from long-term ecological foresight and driven solely by corporate greed, can easily turn into an engine of global ruin. 4. John Nash. John Nash was a mathematical prodigy whose revolutionary game theory rewritten the rules of modern economics, evolutionary biology, and military strategy before he was even 30 years old. His astonishing ability to find elegant, mathematical order in complex human interactions made him a shining star at Princeton and MIT, marked by peers as a once-in-a-generation mind. Yet this incredible capacity to see patterns where others saw chaos carried a hidden, agonizing cost. The intense pressure of his academic career, coupled with a highly sensitive, introverted temperament, created a dangerous instability. Nash felt a relentless, driving anxiety to constantly produce work of equal or greater brilliance, a mental strain that began to blur the boundary between profound mathematical insight and deep psychological delusion. The breaking point arrived in 1959, when his brilliant mind fractured under the weight of paranoid schizophrenia. The celebrated mathematician began to experience vivid, terrifying hallucinations, believing that he was being pursued by communist conspirators, and that he was receiving coded messages from extraterrestrials in the pages of *, the New York Times *. The immediate consequences were devastating. Nash was repeatedly hospitalized against his will, subjected to brutal insulin shock therapies, and forced to resign his academic positions. For over 3 decades, his life was defined by a heartbreaking struggle for sanity, as he wandered the Princeton campus like a ghost, writing cryptic equations on blackboards and fighting a silent, exhausting war against the voices in his head. Against all odds, Nash achieved a remarkable period of remission in his later years, learning to consciously reject his delusions and reclaim his academic life, a triumph that culminated in him receiving the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1994. Tragically, his journey came to a sudden end in 2015, when he and his wife were killed in a car crash. But his legacy remains a testament to the fragile majesty of the human brain. Nash's life offers a profound lesson on the vulnerability of intellect, showing us that even the most powerful, logical mind can be betrayed by its own biology. His struggle reminds us that sanity is a fragile gift, and that true strength lies not in the absence of madness, but in the painful, courageous decision to fight our way back to reality. 5. Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla was a visionary wizard of the electrical age, a man whose mind inhabited a future that was decades, if not centuries, ahead of his contemporaries. His brilliant inventions, most notably the alternating current (AC) system, the Tesla coil, and early wireless transmission concepts, laid the very foundations of our modern, electrified world. Tesla possessed a rare, visual genius, capable of designing and testing complex machines entirely within his own mind before committing them to paper. However, this extraordinary cognitive gift was accompanied by a severe lack of business acumen and a profound psychological vulnerability. Operating in the cutthroat, hyper-capitalist landscape of Gilded Age America, Tesla was constantly pressured by predatory financiers and rival inventors, most notably Thomas Edison and J.P. Morgan, who sought to exploit his genius for profit while casting him aside when his ideas grew too ambitious. The turning point occurred when his grandest, most idealistic project, the Wardenclyffe Tower, designed to provide free wireless energy to the entire world, was abruptly abandoned due to a lack of funding, shattering Tesla's dreams and his financial stability. The immediate consequence was a slow, agonizing descent into poverty, obscurity, and severe mental illness. Tesla retreated from the scientific community, his mind increasingly dominated by severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and bizarre eccentricities. He became intensely phobic of germs, developed a strange obsession with the number 3 and its multiples, and spent his dwindling funds feeding and caring for the wild pigeons of New York City. He began declaring that he had invented a death ray capable of destroying entire armies, a claim that alienated the scientific establishment and solidified his reputation as a mad scientist. Tesla's journey ended in 1943 in a small, lonely room at the New Yorker Hotel, where he passed away at the age of 86, penniless, forgotten, and surrounded by his beloved pigeons. The tragedy of his final years highlights the devastating misalignment between pure, altruistic scientific vision and the cold realities of commercial exploitation. Tesla's life is a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of the idealistic genius who lacks the armor to survive in a predatory world. His legacy serves as a poignant reminder that society often eagerly devours the fruits of an inventor's labor, while callously leaving the inventor themselves to starve in the cold, dark corners of the world they helped to build. 6. Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was the ultimate embodiment of the American dream, a dashing, charismatic billionaire who conquered the worlds of aviation, Hollywood filmmaking, and industrial manufacturing with breathtaking audacity. As a pilot, he personally designed and flew revolutionary aircraft, shattering multiple world airspeed records and building one of the greatest business empires on the planet. Yet this soaring public persona masked a deeply fractured inner world that was constantly under attack by his own mind. The immense, relentless pressure of managing his vast fortune, coupled with the physical trauma of multiple near-fatal plane crashes, severely exacerbated a lifelong, undiagnosed case of obsessive-compulsive disorder and a profound fear of illness. Despite having unlimited wealth and influence, Hughes was constantly haunted by a silent, invisible enemy, the microscopic world of germs. The turning point occurred in the late 1950s, when Hughes's fear of contamination completely hijacked his life, prompting him to withdraw entirely from public view and retreat into a bizarre, hermetically sealed isolation. The immediate consequences of this psychological surrender were horrifying. He spent his final years living in darkened penthouse suites with the windows blacked out, sitting naked in a single chair for months at a time, surrounded by safe zones created from Kleenex boxes. He refused to cut his hair or nails, stored his own urine in jars, and communicated with his staff through highly complex, written instructions on how to handle objects without touching them. The billionaire who once commanded global industries was now a helpless prisoner of his own severe mysophobia, living in a self-inflicted hell. When Hughes died in 1976 en route to a hospital, he was so emaciated, neglected, and physically ruined that the FBI had to use fingerprints to identify his body. His vast fortune, which should have guaranteed him the finest quality of life, had instead funded the construction of the world's most expensive, high-tech prison cell. His life offers a chilling, philosophical lesson on the limits of material wealth and power, proving that all the money in the world cannot buy a person escape from a decaying mind. Hughes's tragedy serves as a stark warning that when we neglect our mental health in the relentless pursuit of control and perfection, we risk becoming the architects of our own elaborate, miserable captivity. 7. Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh possessed a revolutionary, highly sensitive artistic genius, a man who saw the world not in static shapes, but as a vibrant, swirling canvas of raw emotion, light, and color. His unique ability to translate his deep, internal experiences into masterpieces like *The Starry Night* and *Sunflowers* would eventually redefine the course of modern art history. Yet this extraordinary sensitivity was a double-edged sword, leaving him completely exposed to the harsh, cold realities of a world that refused to understand or support him. Throughout his brief life, Van Gogh was driven by a desperate, agonizing pressure to find love, acceptance, and a sense of purpose, a struggle that was constantly thwarted by his severe depression, debilitating anxiety, and recurring, violent episodes of mental illness. The crisis point arrived during his time in Arles, France, where his fragile mental stability completely collapsed under the weight of loneliness and an intense, volatile relationship with fellow artist Paul Gauguin. Following a heated argument, Van Gogh suffered a severe psychotic break, during which he severed his own left ear and presented it to a local maid, an act of self-mutilation that shocked the local community and led to his voluntary admission to an asylum. The immediate consequence was a highly unstable, productive period, where he painted feverishly between debilitating episodes of madness, desperately trying to outrun the encroaching darkness. Tragically, the emotional pain became too much to bear, and in 1890, at the age of 37, he walked into a wheat field and shot himself in the chest, dying 2 days later. At the time of his death, Van Gogh had sold only a single painting, living in absolute poverty and believing himself to be a complete and utter failure. The profound, heartbreaking lesson of his life is a cautionary tale about the devastating cost of a society that fails to recognize, cherish, and support its most sensitive and creative minds while they are still alive. Van Gogh's tragedy reminds us that true artistic genius is often born from a place of immense vulnerability, and that without empathy, compassion, and community support, the very light that allows an artist to illuminate the world can easily consume and destroy the artists themselves in the process. 8. Aaron Swartz. Aaron Swartz was a true prodigy of the digital age, a brilliant programmer and political activist who co-authored the RSS specification at the age of 14 and helped build the social media giant Reddit. Swartz possessed a rare, idealistic genius, viewing the internet not as a tool for commercial exploitation, but as a revolutionary medium for the free, democratic exchange of human knowledge. He was driven by a deep, unyielding belief that access to information is a fundamental human right, a conviction that placed him under immense, constant pressure to challenge the powerful institutions that sought to lock knowledge behind expensive paywalls. This noble, unyielding idealism set him on a dangerous, direct collision course with the full, intimidating power of the United States federal government. The turning point occurred in 2011, when Swartz used a laptop connected to the MIT network to systematically download millions of academic journal articles from the digital library JSTOR, intending to make them freely available to the public. The immediate consequences of this act of civil disobedience were swift and devastatingly disproportionate. The federal government, eager to make an example of the young activist, prosecuted him under the draconian Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, hitting him with 13 felony charges that carried a potential sentence of up to 35 years in prison and millions of dollars in fines. Facing the prospect of financial ruin, the destruction of his career, and decades of imprisonment, the 26-year-old was plunged into a severe, paralyzing depression. In January 2013, overwhelmed by the crushing pressure of the impending trial and the uncompromising stance of the prosecution, Swartz took his own life in his Brooklyn apartment. His tragic death sent shockwaves through the tech and academic communities, sparking intense outrage and a profound debate over the ethics of information access and the prosecutorial overreach of the justice system. The cautionary lesson of Swartz's life is a heartbreaking reminder of what happens when a highly sensitive, idealistic mind is crushed by the cold, unyielding gears of a rigid legal apparatus. His tragedy warns us that a society that prioritizes the protection of corporate and institutional property over the preservation of its most brilliant, public-minded youth risks extinguishing the very minds capable of building a better future. 9. William James Sidis. William James Sidis is widely believed to have possessed the highest intelligence quotient in recorded human history, With an estimated IQ ranging between 250 and 300. At an age when most children are learning to read, Sidis was already fluent in multiple languages, and by the age of 11, he became the youngest person ever to enroll at Harvard University, giving a celebrated lecture on four-dimensional bodies to the Harvard Mathematical Socratic Club. However, this staggering intellectual development was the result of an intense, highly controversial educational regime forced upon him by his father, Boris Sidis, a pioneering psychologist who viewed his son as a scientific experiment in maximized human potential. This relentless, suffocating pressure to perform robbed William of his childhood, leaving him socially isolated, emotionally stunted, and deeply resentful of the spotlight. The turning point came shortly after his graduation from Harvard, when the intense, constant scrutiny of the media and the impossible expectations of his parents became entirely unbearable. Sidis suffered a quiet, profound rebellion of the mind, choosing to completely reject his mathematical genius and vanish into a life of absolute obscurity. The immediate consequences were a series of low-paying, menial clerical jobs. Whenever his co-workers or employers discovered his true identity, he would immediately quit and flee to another city to escape the attention. He devoted his brilliant mind to eccentric, trivial hobbies, such as collecting streetcar transfers and writing obscure, self-published books on highly specific historical topics under various pseudonyms, desperately seeking to be perceived as ordinary. Sidis lived his remaining years in a state of self-imposed, lonely exile, avoiding his family and the scientific community entirely, until he passed away in 1944 at the age of 46 from a cerebral hemorrhage. His tragic life serves as a profound, cautionary warning to parents, educators, and society about the dangers of forcing a child's intellectual development at the expense of their emotional and social well-being. Sidis's story is a heartbreaking reminder that a human mind, no matter how profoundly gifted, cannot survive on intellect alone. His legacy teaches us that without the freedom to develop a healthy, authentic identity and experience the simple joys of a normal life, the most brilliant mind will eventually wither and retreat into the dark, protective corners of obscurity. 10. Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer was a towering figure of theoretical physics, possessing a brilliant, synthesis-driven mind that could effortlessly bridge the gap between abstract quantum mechanics and practical, large-scale engineering. As the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, he was the charismatic leader who united the world's greatest scientific minds in the secret laboratory of Los Alamos, working feverishly to harness the fundamental forces of the universe. The driving pressure behind his work was a terrifying, high-stakes race against time, the profound fear that Nazi Germany would develop an atomic weapon first. Under this existential threat, Oppenheimer pushed his team and himself to the absolute limits of human endurance, culminating in the successful detonation of the first atomic bomb and elevating him to the status of a national hero. The turning point for Oppenheimer was not a failure of technology, but a devastating awakening of his moral conscience. As the horrific reports and graphic images of the sheer devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki filtered back to him, his initial triumph dissolved into a profound, paralyzing crisis of faith. He realized that his scientific genius had birthed an instrument of apocalyptic destruction, leading him to famously quote the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This internal torment quickly translated into a fierce, public opposition to the development of the even more destructive hydrogen bomb, placing him directly in the crosshairs of the U.S. military establishment. The immediate consequence of his moral stand was a swift, humiliating fall from grace. In 1954, he was subjected to a grueling, highly biased security hearing where his loyalty was questioned and his security clearance was stripped. Oppenheimer spent the final decade of his life as a broken, deeply melancholic man, living under the constant shadow of political suspicion and fighting a losing battle with throat cancer. Though he was eventually awarded the Enrico Fermi Award as a gesture of political rehabilitation, the wounds to his spirit and his sense of identity were far too deep to ever truly heal, and he passed away in 1967, carrying an unbearable burden of guilt. The profound lesson of Oppenheimer's life is a timeless warning about the weaponization of scientific discovery. Oppenheimer's tragedy is the ultimate cautionary tale of the modern age, forcing us to confront the reality that once the box of technological innovation is opened, the creator completely loses control over how their creation will be used by those in power. These extraordinary, tragic lives reveal a haunting, universal truth. Supreme intelligence is not a protective shield, but a volatile, high-energy force that requires deep emotional grounding, ethical boundaries, and human connection to survive. When we isolate these brilliant minds on pedestals of impossible expectations, we strip away the very empathy and community they need to stay anchored to our shared reality. Ultimately, we must ask ourselves, is a life of world-altering genius truly worth the price of a shattered mind and a lonely, tragic end? Or is the quiet, ordinary pursuit of human connection the greatest intelligence of all?